This is FLOSS Weekly. I'm Doc Searls. This week, Simon Phipps and I are talking with Brian Behlendorf, who's the primary author of Apache, which is serving most of your websites that you're looking at right now, and so much more. He's had a long and illustrious career for somebody who's still remarkably young. Right now, working for the Linux Foundation on OpenSSF. He's worked with the World Economic Forum. We just met at D-Web Camp, had a good time there. He's a DJ, among other things. He's forgotten about more topics than anybody else I know, and he says a lot in this show, which is coming up next.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is FLOSS Weekly, episode 697, recorded Wednesday, September 7, 2022. The Life of Brian. This episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by IRL, an original podcast from Mozilla. IRL is a show for people who build AI and people who develop tech policies. Hosted by Bridget Todd, this season of IRL looks at AI in real life. Search for IRL in your podcast player. And by Compiler, an original podcast from Red Hat discussing tech topics big, small, and strange. Listen to Compiler on Apple Podcasts or anywhere you listen to podcasts. And by New Relic. Use the data platform made for the curious. Right now, you can get access to the whole New Relic platform and 100 gigabytes of data per month, free forever. No credit card required. Sign up at newrelic.com/floss. Good morning, good evening, good whatever it is, wherever you are. I am Doc Searls, and this is FLOSS Weekly. I'm joined this week from not quite the other side of the world, but another part of it, by Simon Phipps. How are you, Simon? There he is.
I'm a universe away here, Doc. I can hear you. You've got the sound of parakeets, and I can hear there's probably grass-skirted hula dancers next to you. And I'm here. I've just been checking the sandbags outside my office because we're expecting a flood. And I haven't seen the cat for some time because I think she was washed away in the rain earlier.
We expect fire here. This is California. Right. Next week I'll be back in Indiana. And this is actually in front of my house in Santa Barbara. It's been wickedly hot here, and hotter for a guest than it has been for me. But we have no air conditioning because we share with Northern Europe and perhaps the UK as well. This myth that it never gets hot, you don't need air conditioning, and so we've been sweltering. My office is 106 degrees, which is 40 Celsius or something like that, 40 something. It's up there. High 30s or 40 maybe. Not sure. So you're doing good. Yep. You're looking good.
Well, thank you. Yes, it's life is busy. I'm looking after my elders. My son just had twins, or his wife did.
Oh wow.
And he helped somehow, and
maybe
life
they each
is really
had
busy. Yeah, they could. My daughter-in-law definitely had both of them. She remembers it well.
Well, that's increasing. As my uncle, who had 5 sons who all had a lot of kids, called them all reinforcements coming in. So our guest this morning it is very special. It's Brian Behlendorf, who both of us have known for a very long time, I think. Tell us a little bit about your background with him. I know Brian from covering him as a journalist, but
Brian is one of the people who I think you could credit as being the originators of the popularity of the web because of Apache web server. Yeah. He's also a wonderfully human person who loves the right sort of music and enjoys dancing to it. He's also one of the people who helped start OSI, where I spent a decade trying to help it survive. And he's also been a charming friend to me and to all of my friends for the 20 or so years that I've known him. So yeah, he's a very special person.
So I want to get into it as fast as I can. So I'm going to go ahead and give the basic introduction because there's so much that Brian's done. But right now he's the general manager of the Open Source Security Foundation, which is an initiative, they call it, hosted by the Linux Foundation, which has lots of these things. which the last time I talked to their people about it, they called umbrellas and other stuff, but it's a foundation hosting foundations. He also serves on, and he's been with another one with Hyperledger, also serves on the board of directors of the EFF, Mozilla, the Filecoin Foundation, which is a foundation that both of us were hanging out with last week for the decentralized web. Most famously, as you were putting it, I mean, one of the reasons that we have the web that we have is his work with the Apache web server way back when, as an even younger man than he still is, co-founded the Apache Software Foundation, bootstrapped one of the first web consultancies, and another company called GitHub, but 3 generations too early, and also advised the White House during the Obama years. He was a CTO for the World Economic Forum, the WEF, and he set up Burning Man's first web presence. So here, bring him on. Hi, Brian. Now tell me,
hi, Simon.
Did you get a laugh out of Simon just saying that you played music people could dance to? Because
I think he said I enjoy the same music that he does, the right kind of music and music you can dance to. I do DJ, but I am not quite the best at the whole beat matching thing. I try, it was easier when it was vinyl. Now that it's all digital, it's harder to get a handle on. But I still play music for friends. I actually did at the DWeb camp that we were both at a week and a half ago. And that's still really fun, sharing good music, weirdo stuff made by predominantly electronic stuff, right? But made by people really into it for the fun of it.
I was laughing myself anyway, because your music is very moody, very electronic, and this is at DWeb Camp, which is under the redwoods in far northern California, and it was kind of music you could stand and zone out to. I thought more than dance to. That's not a knock. I thought I loved it. I was enjoying it.
That's really great. I appreciate that. Yeah, no, it was like a reception music. I mean, I was trying to play something that people could talk over and kind of get to know each other too, and that kind of thing. So, but no, it was a lot of fun.
So, and then you were just at Burning Man again, which you did to us, you did described as dusty, which I think it always is. I still haven't been to Burning Man, and I want to go, but hopefully before too long I'll get to. But I kind of want to start out with the decentralized web, or the distributed web, and because there's an aspiration there, and as I told you in an email before this, there's a friend of ours, I think we both know him, but I don't want to give away who it is, who wrote a book about saving the web or something like that, and his working title for the next book is "Well, We Tried," and I'm wondering, because there's a sense I got at DWeb Camp, on the one hand, of great optimism, all these great people, a lot of really good developers, working in many cases for a fraction of what they would make in the commercial market as a 10x programmer, trying to do good things, and yet there's a part of it that felt to me sort of like Jackson Browne's Before the Deluge, where we're actually kind of huddled lying in a burned out basement. So, and I'm wondering, do you have any optimism about this, or what is your optimism like?
I do. I mean, 5 years ago, it would have been hard to be optimistic about the prospect of any social network being able to compete and challenge Facebook, right? But now there are several. Years ago, it would have been difficult to be optimistic about the future of chat, distributed chat. But now, between Mastodon, Discord, which isn't really decentralized, but at least is warming up people's appetite for the idea of different servers and different kind of local communities. We have a different world now. I still remain optimistic, partly for the same reason you have to be optimistic about democracy, or you have to be optimistic about the future of the climate, because if you're not optimistic, kind of why are we here? I mean, it's not unlike one of the reasons, I decided to have a kid with my partner, with Kate, my wife, was, it's a way to not write off the future. It's a way to have to be invested in making something better. And whether you completely win and the internet is re-decentralized, or you've simply been a useful way to counter the power of central platforms and central markets, having any sort of impact is better than having none. So I think it's still a true north worth aligning with, and worth creating opportunities for. And I'm optimistic, not just because I have to be, but because of this community we were in the midst of. The people there were not just kind of building toys, not just talking about things that are fun but not practical. They were building systems that people could run, that people are running, that are more popular outside the United States than inside. I tended to notice a lot of international participation there, and folks connecting it to platform co-ops and initiatives in other countries that aligned with different kind of political systems and priorities and the like. And people giving a damn. And as you mentioned, on the board of this thing called the Filecoin Foundation, which is the incentive platform for a big storage network using a protocol called IPFS as a way to try to not just provide a decentralized alternative to, say, Amazon Glacier, but ultimately an alternative to all forms of network storage and perhaps even CDNs and the like. And that's a system that's running today. It has 15, I believe the current number, although this might be outdated, 15 exabytes of capacity on that network, which is huge. It's several times, several 2 orders of magnitude, I think, larger than the Internet Archive itself, and has been bringing many of these kind of organizations like Internet Archive, Freedom of the Press Foundation, Witness, other human rights organizations along to use this network and see if it can actually serve a purpose beyond just decentralizing Amazon, right? That the ultimate goal has to be something more beneficent, more impactful on society than just taking down the big baddie or something like that. So that's one reason to remain optimistic. And DWeb Camp was only 300 people, but there are communities of thousands of people out there represented at that event, and all that gives me hope. And hope that even people a lot younger than you and I have some of the same principles and ideas floating in their head that we had when we first landed on the internet, and so that was really, it was a great recharge. 4 days, if anyone can make it to the next one, I highly encourage it. dwebcamp.org if anyone's interested.
Yeah, I totally loved it. It's been my wife, who we both know is not a camper. She got a cabin. I have a tent, and but I made sure that I had a 75-foot long extension cord with a power strip at the end of it going to my tent from her cabin. Anyway, you dropped a one-liner that I loved a few years ago, which is, we need minimum viable centralization. And I'm wondering if a kind of corollary to that, or kind of following toward one, might be what has to be centralized? When I started out, my web server was under my desk. I had 16 assigned IP addresses from a competitive local exchange carrier. It was very slow. It was something that laid on top of DSL. It was 1995, but Searls.com lived under my desk. I had my own email server, and I'm not that technical, and I could run these things. And now I wouldn't think of having that, even if I had an IP address, because clouds are better places to host these things today. I don't know if that's actually true. I sort of feel that way, but I'm wondering what has to be centralized at this point, as we look toward decentralizing and distributing as much as we can.
Yeah, and when we first launched Wired.com on the web, it was on the slow end of a 28.8 modem provided by the Little Garden. Do you remember that ISP? One of the first consumer ISPs in the Bay Area. What has to be centralized? Well, the point of that term minimum viable centralization is to get across that the idea that rather than these being two binary states, centralized or decentralized, decentralization is a vector, right? That there is a principle that the more decentralized or decentralizable, the better in all sorts of ways that are difficult to measure, but which tend to lead to better outcomes. So I use the example of the domain name system. The domain name system is not as decentralized as some might say the Bitcoin network or Ethereum network or the cryptocurrency networks can be. There is an organization called ICANN, which has plenty of things that it's done over its 20 plus year history that have caused people to be concerned or critical of it, but has tended to practice, at least from my quasi layman's point of view, this doing only what is necessary to maintain the trust and the technical competency to keep the domain name system running, which, if you think about it, we all take it for granted now. Most people don't know how it works. The fact that it does, and the fact that it does not just technically, but also operationally and politically, is pretty remarkable. It's not attached to the UN. It's not attached to any other, international government or governmental body from the 20 years ago when domain name system management spun out from the Department of Commerce, I think it was. I could be wrong. But it was it's managed to keep this network alive by asking itself and asking the world, what's the smallest bit of thing it could do? Coordinate two things: the root name servers and maintaining a consistent database across all those 18, top level, domain name resolvers. Everyone agrees, by kind of convention to use as the root of the internet, although there's many machines behind each of those nodes. And a second thing, which is the universal domain dispute resolution protocol, which means if somebody registered Walmart.com in your Walmart, you can have a process for claiming that as a trademark, whether that's a human process. That's not a technical process. That it involves integrating with legal systems and the like. And ICANN's been able to navigate and weave and try to, it seems, do as little as possible in order to keep this alive. And I see that in other networks. That's, I think, the role of foundations in open source networks. I think it's the role for some of the different organizations involved in the cryptocurrency space and then the blockchain space. And one of the things in the open source world, as Simon knows well, that serves as a check on power of these organizations is the right to fork, is the right to be able to go in a different direction than the developers or the people who are attached to the brand can do. And if somebody had a better idea for how to build an operating system kernel than Linus, they can start with the Linux kernel and fork and go in a different direction. And that has forced a minimum viable centralization mode on open source software in a really positive way, I think. So
I have the sun blasting through behind me, so I almost look like a religious poster for those of you who are watching. But first, I have to. Simon's chomping at the mic for the next question. But before we get to that, I have to let everybody know that this episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by IRL, an original podcast from Mozilla. IRL is a show for people who build AI and people who develop tech policies. It's hosted by Bridget Todd. This season of IRL looks at AI in real life. Who can AI help? Who can it harm? The show features fascinating conversations with people who are working to build more trustworthy AI. For example, there's an episode about how our world is mapped with AI. The data that's missing from those maps tells as much of a story as the maps themselves. You'll hear all about the people who are working to fill in those gaps and take control of the data. There's another episode about gig workers who depend on apps for their livelihood. It looks at how they're pushing back against algorithms that control how much they get paid and seeking new ways to gain power over data, to create better working conditions. For political junkies, there are episodes about the role that AI plays when it comes to the spread of misinformation and hate speech around elections, a huge concern for democracies around the world. And that is extremely relevant, as we know, because we're entering a political period here. We don't talk politics on a tech show, but tech plays an enormous role in that, and this is a good episode to check out. Search for IRL in your podcast player. We'll also include a link in the show notes. My thanks to IRL for their support.
So, Brian, I'm fascinated by your talk about DWeb, and particularly by interposing Filecoin in there, because to me, anything with the word coin in it automatically invalidates the DWeb concept. Do you think that we're going to be able to pick up on a truly distributed web and get away from the awfulness of the cryptocurrency bubble? Or are we going to have to have a completely separate community working on that. Because when I look at the people working on ActivityPub, they don't do blockchain. They do peered message passing. Do you think that distraction is actually a distraction, or do you think it has a role to play in the future of the distributed web?
So there's a tremendous amount of antipathy, well-deserved, for coins, for crypto, for all things blockchain. And I spent 5 years in the blockchain mines, so to speak, working on a project at the Linux Foundation called Hyperledger, which is distinguished from a lot of the rest of the blockchain space by the fact that it didn't require a cryptocurrency. It wasn't about speculative financial instruments as the red blood cells of a network, as the TCP/IP packets, and instead it was about, here's a way, once you have a community of people, of organizations, of whatever actors on a network working together around and wanting a common system of record, wanting some automation, wanting smart contracts, essentially, here's a way to do it using a consensus mechanism that does not use burning energy as a proxy for political power, which is what this consensus mechanism called proof of work is all about, and which is horrible. And I remember reading the intro and the first couple of pages of Satoshi's paper in 2009, and going, I hope this does not succeed as an environmentalist, because this is a really broken way to build a society, build a network, because of this concept called proof of work. But I resonated with the idea of being able to have a payment network that was not dependent upon central actors, central banks, that sort of thing. I resonated with the calls for decentralization and the fact that up to that point, we had not figured out I don't want to call it a monetization model, but a sustainability model or something that mirrored how we use cash and how we use other kinds of financial instruments very locally. And there's tons of use cases. You're probably familiar with the self-sovereign identity world. The self-sovereign identity concept needs a decentralized platform, or at least minimally centralized platform, to be able to handle the key distribution and key verification. And so there's all these use cases that started to emerge. I think the one that grabbed me was verification of diamonds in a supply chain for to implement something called the Kimberley Protocol to try to keep conflict diamonds out of a diamond supply chain, where there was no central actor that everybody could agree to trust. You needed a distributed database resilient to hostile actors that anybody could write to, that you could verify the transactions in order to have something trustworthy amongst a community. And so that has been kind of lost, and it's been buried in the noise of NFTs, which I do think have a role and are interesting, being able to say I have an asset and not have it be attached to a major institution, but be something, again, self-sovereign, self-directed, I really resonate with. But that community had done itself no favors, both proof of work, the scams, the rejection of institutions, kind of as a first principle, caused a lot of people to rightfully write it off. And each time there's been a downswing, to claim victory, right? But at the same time, I think there's something here. And what pulled me in to Filecoin, wince if you'd like around the name, but first it was around IPFS. IPFS being a protocol for using the address of an object is the hash of that object, and so if you've called for that object and it arrives, that it is the same thing. It is the actual thing that you asked for, not somebody's version of that thing or some hacked version of that thing or some censored version of that thing. It's content address storage, right? And kind of like BitTorrent, stuff only stays up so long as somebody is seeding it, and not everybody can be a seeder on the network effectively, right? You want to be able to pay other people to seed it and do that in an efficient way that doesn't just end up re-centralizing it on a few payment providers. And so I resonated with that. I resonated with, okay, this is a useful thing to decentralize. This is a useful thing to push out and try to avoid encumbering with the same things that end up re-centralizing a lot of the things that we've loved to decentralize. I mean, this has been the bane of folks working on web technologies, is every time we come up with something cool like OAuth, It ends up, we envision a world where anybody can be their own authentication provider, their own third-party attester to somebody's login, and yet it ends up just reinforcing the centralization plans and protocols of a few players. This seemed to be a great way to address that. It also was full of people, the organization as I met them, the ones working on IPFS and working on Filecoin at the same time, were people like Juan Bennett and Molly I'm blanking on the last name, sorry, who leads the engineering team around a lot of this work. They're really warm people. They're people who got that strength comes from transparency, strength in technology comes from building a large constituency. That when you've got a protocol, sending it through the Internet Engineering Task Force is the right thing to do. But who just had this really expansive vision for it that resonated with. It reminded me more of those early days of the internet and people using communities to build constituencies around protocols. So that's kind of why I threw my hat in there. The fact that it's a currency people can invest in is kind of a necessary byproduct of the fact that it's a payments platform. But I think it stands apart from the rest of the crypto industry, and its consensus mechanism is not based on proof of work. It's based on showing you're actually storing things for other people. So its utility is directly connected to its sustainability model, which I really liked as well.
Right. Well, I mean, I had a go at deploying IPFS on my own systems, and I found it was really quite difficult to do. I found it was difficult to get material reliably delivered to me. And I also looked into Filecoin and found that it seemed to expect you to be participating on a scale that made it impossible for individuals to participate. And overall, IPFS to me feels like it's conceptually the right place to go, but it's still burdened with a libertarian ideology that is preventing it from going forward and helping people to do things on a human scale rather than on a finance industry scale. What am I missing? What am I getting wrong in trying to do this?
Well, distributed storage is really hard. We're used to a world where the CDNs replicate content on a vast scale across many, many different copies and make it really quick to pull down, right? And when you compare that to pulling a file down using BitTorrent, for example, BitTorrent is pretty slow because if there's only a few people seeding that network, seeding that content, pulling it from 3 different remote IP addresses, even in parallel, can cause things to arrive pretty slowly. The more replication there is in the network, the more copies of that content, and the higher quality that the serving infrastructure is. So Filecoin has been trying to encourage the establishment of calibrated for the right type of storage providers, those who can run somewhat beefy servers well connected to the network. That can deliver the content quickly and get paid for that as an alternative to people seeding from their home boxes. Now, that means it's not perhaps as decentralized as BitTorrent is, where people might be seeding from over their home, DSL connections or cable modem connections or the like. But it's trying to address that concern about performance. This is a hard thing to do, is all I can state about that. And I do think a lot of the funding model right now is dependent upon attracting investment. This is not easy technology to write. So if it has that kind of air of, at least on the websites, of a little bit of a corporate sheen, that's out of a desire to be taken seriously.
Yeah. So I think that's really partly my concern. I don't see any of these technologies showing up in Mastodon or in Plume or in PixelFed. All of those are using very simple peer-to-peer message passing mechanisms. They're not using systems that require you to own a data center to deploy them, or require you to be a Bitcoin whale in order to get enough coins to be able to float them. And that's what makes me feel there's this divide between the world that Filecoin is in, and the world that actually Linux Foundation is in, and the world that Mastodon and PixelFed are in, where it seems to be individuals who are highly motivated to create truly distributed human scale applications. And really none of this technology is anything that they even could use if they weren't disdainful of it.
Well, message passing is a very different thing than serving, medium-sized large files, right? Like I just sending 256 bytes around or 280 characters or that kind of thing is just a very different kind of use case than sending around large media, and so it's going to lend itself to different protocols and different kinds of systems. The cultural thing, though, Simon, I wish you were at DWebCamp, because you would have seen a lot of folks mixing between these technologies in a way that doesn't come across when you look at the websites. I'd like to bring you into the Slack channels for IPFS. You could talk there about seeing where the emerging support is for IPFS into not just some of the other distributed web and self-hosted and indie web kinds of approaches, kind of technologies, but into things like WordPress and Drupal as a storage platform, right? So I'm not, look, it has its own challenges. Again, it's trying to do a hard thing. And at this point, I kind of feel like supporting everybody trying to do hard things and doing it with varying degrees of success, but with a measure of success is more important than trying to draw lines around communities.
The only reason I ask it is because I did have an idea over in the Document Foundation in the LibreOffice community about how we could use IPFS to get away from having Google Docs and Office 365 as our document models, and that really involved bringing those two worlds together. And so I've actually had a go at doing it, and I've discovered it's really hard to bring those worlds together to do something real, because the side that's doing all the coiny stuff doesn't really like working with the side that's doing all of the chatty stuff, and vice versa. And so I keep on drawing a blank. I'm quite interested in the DWebCamp. It's just a pity it was in America, because unfortunately I'm not going to go there for reasons that I'm not allowed to discuss on this program. So
the host of this all is the Internet Archive. It was Brewster, and I have a sense that he would really resonate with the idea of replicating DWebCamp in other places, other countries. So maybe the thing to do is for us to go approach him and see about doing one in the UK soon.
Glue it onto Debian, onto DebConf, because they always pick places that people who don't like invasive international security are still able to get to.
I know that Simon has a follow-up on that, but first I have to let people know that this episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by Compiler, an original podcast from Red Hat discussing tech topics big, small, and strange. Compiler comes to you from the makers of Command Line Heroes and other of our sponsors, and is hosted by Angela Andrews and Brent Simoneau. Technology can be big, bold, bizarre, and complicated. Compiler unravels industry topics, trends, and the things you've always wanted to know about tech through interviews with the people who know it best. On their show, you'll hear a chorus of perspectives from the diverse communities behind the code. Compiler brings together a curious team of Red Hatters to tackle big questions in tech, like what is technical debt? What are tech hiring managers actually looking for? And do you have to know how to code to get started with open source? Episode 2, for example, covers what can video games teach us about edge computing. The internet is a patchwork of international agreements and varying infrastructure, but there's something coming to change the ways we connect. In this episode of Compiler, hosts explore what edge computing could mean for people who enjoy video games and what this form of entertainment could teach us about the technology. Episode 9, how are tech hubs changing? Traditionally, if someone wanted a career in tech, they've had to make the move to a tech hub, a city packed with startups and talent, but things are starting to change. The hosts of Compiler speak to a few of the change makers who are thinking outside of the physical and social dimensions they've come to associate with innovation. Actually, I'm a living example of somebody who came west to join a tech hub. That's where I met our guest today and many others. But I'm always moving now. And in fact, the place where I'm living most of the time is not a tech hub and wants to be. I'm not even sure that's still a viable concept. So really good episode 9 there. Learn more about Compiler at red.ht/twit. New episodes are out now. Go and download them at any time and be sure to check back for new shows. Listen to Compiler on Apple Podcasts or anywhere you listen to podcasts. We'll also include a link on this episode's show page. My thanks to Compiler for their support. So we were talking a little bit earlier. Let's move on to thinking about your current day job, and security systems here. Is that, what's your motivation for being involved in that? Is that to do with big corporate supply chains, or is that to do with protecting civilization? Which end of the scale is that on?
You speak of those at least as if those are opposites, but which they might be. No, about a year ago, after 5 years in Hyperledger, I tend to go through, I don't want to say career ADD, but the longer I've tended to spend on a thing, the more I've regretted it. So I always keep my ear open for what's going on. And there had been two efforts that had started. One centered around GitHub, the other centered around Google, looking at how is it that we're writing software in the open source world from a security point of view, and could we be doing that better? Not with a specific exploit or approach in mind, but simply to say, there seem to be quite a few CVEs in open source, which you'd expect because the code is open. It's easier to audit. It's easier for people to crawl through and find things, and more frequent, which you'd also expect as open source is getting used in more critical infrastructure kinds of applications. More and more people trust it. But the kind of trust that we earned in the open source world in the early days, which was really because of a sense of stewardship, a sense of a community taking responsibility for each release. At Apache, we tended to say you can't cut a release until two other people have signed off on it. The kinds of diligence and processes we had that led to people trusting open source software, by default, which was great and helped us scale up, wasn't something that was necessarily earned in every situation. There is a lot of open source, there has been a lot of open source release that has not been built to the levels of diligence, perhaps, that we set in those early days, and that there's new kinds of attacks that take advantage of the fact that open source emerged when things were high trust, when finding a package under an appropriate license on a website you'd never been to before, or a GitHub org you'd never seen before, you tended to trust that rather than not trust it. You might scrutinize it, you might look at the code, but let's be honest, Simon, even as developers or people who could crawl through code, most of the time we did not before pulling in a package or using it at the very least, perhaps even incorporating it into our work. And so a couple of these developers and companies started to put some ideas together about how to address some of these issues. Some of it was supply chain related, meaning things like when you're a developer and you're pulling in dependencies, how do you choose which dependencies to use? How do you avoid getting caught by, the kind of typo squatting bugs that had started to hit, where you think you're pulling in one package and instead you're pulling in a fork of that package that implemented a cryptocurrency miner behind the scenes, that kind of thing. Some of it was around specifications. There's this whole world now that I still don't understand entirely called the DevSecOps world, a part of which is as you're pushing things from development to release and deployment on the cloud, you have different risk tolerances, and that risk tolerance for should be associated with your processes for developing software, where you might choose to use riskier, younger modules in one path and more stable things in another path, or simply want to know that the things that were built from source, how verifiable is that, how many people were involved in cutting that release, that sort of thing. So that's a specification called SALSA. Other things were simply a matter of education. If you look at major CVEs out there, they tend to fall into patterns such as, too much trust in user contributed input, off by one errors in memory allocation and freeing that lead to memory corruption bugs. These kinds of recurring things, which are hard-earned experiences for many developers, but you could put into a package and teach people about, which we did. There's a training course called Secure Software Development, which goes through through many of these kinds of issues. And so these two efforts were kind of put together into kind of a lightly resourced thing called, which was then called OpenSSF. There wasn't any kind of funding around it so much as like, let's figure this out. Let's see if we can do something one step better than the original Core Infrastructure Initiative effort, which stepped in after the Heartbleed incident to try to fix OpenSSL. Had some success there, but also some challenges. And instead, let's really get to how software is written, and not just open source software. Open source is now, by some measures, 90% of an average software stack. So fixing this for open source means really trying to fix it for the entirety of the software world. And so it was what really crystallized things, though, for us was in December, the Log4j breach, the compromise known as Log4Shell, that caused some pretty serious earthquakes out there because it was so easy to compromise, because Log4j was so pervasive throughout so many applications, and many people didn't realize they were even using it or what version they were on, that sort of thing. And that prompted some attention at the kind of highest levels of at least the U.S. government, where we got a call at the Linux Foundation and at OpenSSF to attend a meeting along with Apache and 10 other companies convened by the National Security Council, which, by the way, when the National Security Council invites you to an event, it's not a birthday party. It's a pretty serious conversation. And after 6 hours, the result of that was a little bit of a prod to both us as nonprofits and to the companies to say, well, how are you going to fix the problems that you note out there? I see you've got some interesting starts to fixing these issues, but how do you actually get towards closing these issues, these larger systemic kinds of issues that are partly supply chain related, partly education related, et cetera? And, OpenSSF by that point had accumulated a couple dozen different initiatives, software specifications, handing out multi-factor auth tokens to developers of important projects, funding of third-party code reviews, audits, that kind of thing. And so we developed something called the OpenSSF Mobilization Plan, which is a document that outlines 10 different systemic issues and how we might go try to have a double-digit % impact on those issues. And the community wrote these 10 different streams. They put together targets. They put together a rough sense of how much it might cost to fund the center of those solutions, but how much, depending upon volunteerism and then depending upon working with the open source community to get the kind of leverage to have the impact you want. We put this out there and realized that these different initiatives would cost some money because you have to pay for some things, especially when those things are more like let's encrypt their ongoing services than they are necessarily about writing code. And put together this plan that called for $150 million in funding, which it sounds like a lot for an open source project and sounds like it's a bunch of corporates asking, the government to pay for something. But instead it was, here's $150 million worth of prevention that hopefully can lead to several billions or more of cure, right? Help avoid spending billions of dollars in curing things after the fact. And Log4j cost a whole lot more to the industry and to government than $150 million. So this was the big idea. And we're executing on that now. OpenSSF is still very much a bottoms up volunteer open source community. All these initiatives are public facing. Anybody can join. We're really desperate for people to join these different initiatives and working groups and the like. And part of what I'm doing now is going out and trying to get resources for these different parts of the plan, not just from the private sector, but from grants from other organizations and from countries that finally realize that, hey, they need to pony up. They need to help ensure the long-term viability of this software as critical infrastructure. If this is the roads and highways and water and power systems of the modern world, there's a role for government to play in ensuring their long-term safety and their long-term viability. And so, and that's not just something the U.S. government realizes now, but quite a few others around the world. So, so that's what we're doing at OpenSSF.
Brian, that was a very good introduction to the project that you're working in. Just stepping back from that slightly. Do you think that you're covering all of the risks that face software, or just the ones that impact companies that are building software into their products. For example, what happens when a project decides to corrupt the code because they are disgusted by some of their downstream users, as happened on Node? What happens when a company decides that they're leaving money on the table and changes to a proprietary license, like just happened with Akka today? Are you covering those sorts of risks as well in your thinking?
So I think the answer is partly yes, in that some of those attacks are supply chain attacks where either you talk about somebody's credentials getting compromised in a world like NPM, where there are many modules with one developer behind them, of small pieces that are incorporated everywhere, right? And the prospect of one of those either getting hacked or deciding, hey, they need to pay off some debt, so they'll sell their credentials, and they're kind of anonymous anyway, so they'll move on to the next identity, or deciding to protest the invasion of the Ukraine, or a sense of being taken advantage of because their code is used everywhere and they don't seem to be getting any help, and deciding to, I think it was colors.js that
that's the one.
Messages, and there was another one that was the Ukrainian invasion protestware, that sort of thing. And there are some techniques to try to prevent against those kinds of surprises, many of which are caused by the fact that there, in so much of the CI/CD pipelines that incorporate NPM and JavaScript, they pull off the tip of the trees for many of the dependencies without really adequately testing, behavior, and then they push live, right? So part of one of the approaches called scorecards, which is trying to develop a objective measure for the safety of a piece of software and the risk around using some code. One of the things it looks for is, are you pinning your dependencies? Meaning, are you pulling from the tip of the tree in those dependencies, or are you locking into a certain version that you've tested and know work? Which is one way of protecting against surprises like that. But ultimately, it still depends upon this thing we have in open source, which is if you're pulling from upstream, if you're pulling from the GitHub repo, you're kind of responsible for its behavior and you need to be testing it. There's nothing that absolves you of that. There's nothing also inherently in this that absolves the developer burnout issues and that sense of free ridership that happens. Although I do think that greater security comes from code that is written by teams of people rather than by lone gunmen, right? That come from a development process that has things like people signing off on pull requests, people signing off on releases, and putting their names behind it, putting their reputations behind it, than individual modules aggregated by the thousands and pushed out. And it also, there's a thing around identity here that I think is worth kind of just acknowledging. I think a lot of us in the early days, the world was smaller. We could know people by their first names. We could meet people face to face often in what we're doing, and we could trust their software partly because of a sense of assurance of, if this is Linus looking over the Linux kernel process, right, or Simon working on Open Office. That kind of social trust doesn't scale to the thousands of components that are pulled into modern platforms. And so how do we approximate that with other kinds of measurement of trustworthiness of code, but also we might need to look at reputation systems that take into account the other projects you're involved in and the kind of the longevity you've had in a community and that sort of thing, and really, frankly, should not take into account things like nation of origin or IP address of your contributions or anything like that, which is an ongoing debate in some circles.
I have a question that you're probably not anticipating. It's not on the list of topics we went over ahead of the show, but and may not be answerable. But first, I have to let everybody know that this episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by New Relic. Devs are some of the most curious people, the first to explore the newest tech, wanting to know how and why things work. That's why so many engineers talk to New Relic. New Relic gives you data about what you build and shows what's really happening in your software lifecycle. It's a single place to see the data from your entire stack, so you don't have to look into 16 different tools and make those connections manually. New Relic pinpoints issues down to the line of code, so you know why the problems are happening and can resolve them quickly. That's why more than 6,000 companies use New Relic. When teams come together around data, it allows you to triage problems, be confident in decisions, and reduce the time needed to implement resolutions using data, not opinions. Use the data platform made for the curious. Access the whole New Relic platform and 100 gigabytes of data per month, free forever, no credit card required. Sign up at newrelic.com/floss. That's NEWRELIC.com/floss. newrelic.com/floss. So Brian, you grew up in either involved with or in the shadow of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Southern California. Do I have that right? I think I do.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
A little town called La Cunada, where all the scientists kind of lived. And yeah, it was right up the street from my high school.
Yeah. So you were around space as a thing. And I'm wondering about open source in space. I'm on a list, and it's a couple of people have been on the show or on the same list of people who are trying to, in a very open sourcey kind of way, to get through to Elon Musk and Starlink, and not having a lot of success in spite of their really, alpha credentials. And I'm wondering if open source and space work together very well yet. What do you think about that? Do you have thoughts about it at all? If not, we'll go on to another topic.
I can't say I've thought about that much. Look, model rocketry seems like one of those domains where amateurs have tended to be a source of a lot of innovation, where there's now model rocket clubs that are getting things into low Earth orbit. But the space industry almost tends to be the definition of heavy industry. And it's hard to imagine putting substantial amounts of payload or people into space using open source software. I can sooner manage an open source car company than I can imagine an open source space industry, in terms of at least like the lift capacity. But the microsatellites boom suggests that the cost of being able to get something sitting in space that is sending and receiving data might come down to a point soon where it's reasonable to think about hobbyists getting a platform up there, or small companies getting hardware into space. And I also think Starlink isn't in a position where others won't be able to replicate what they do, although I worry about that from the point of view of space junk and visual pollution for ground-based observatories and that sort of thing. But I don't know if space ever goes completely open source, in the way that the internet has. I'm trying to think of other real-world comparisons, but it's easier for me to envision the car industry going a bit more open source than the space industry right now.
And I don't even know what network the cell phone in my car that's narking on us is talking to. So I don't have as much hope for that as I would like. So, but let me pivot from that to, since the space, all the space programs are, they originally were government and now they're more private than, private in addition to government. But you've worked with the WEF and other organizations like that. You've worked in DC or with DC. How do we get governments to care about open source standards, culture, data, and the rest of it?
Yeah, well, when I worked in the Obama campaign in 2008, and then when I went to go work at the Office of Science and Tech Policy in 2009, I don't think there was anybody in the executive branch who had ever, written a line of code in their lives. It had been so much the case for 30 years that the principle was technology was what the private sector does. Government actors, whether political appointees or the mass of people in government, the people employed by the government, all shouldn't deal with technology. That's something you push out to the vendor community, and that is broken, because even to be a smart consumer of technology and of companies providing that, you have to know what you want to have built. You have to know how to evaluate what's been built for you. All this. So, 2009 me was very frustrated in DC trying to get talk to people, not just about open government, which was kind of more the premise I was brought in, but about open source software in particular as as a form of public good, as a way to help entrepreneurship, help avoid concentration of power. I'm still remember kind of the ownership of a platform of the desktop by Microsoft, right? Those sorts of things, and that remediating that wasn't about breaking up monopolies so much as it had to be about providing better alternatives. So that was a very frustrating experience. 13 years later, I'm sitting on a a congressional committee, the House Science, Space and Technology Committee, interviewing me and the CIO of the Air Force and Amelie Caron, who is in DC and has done technology for agencies for a long time, about software supply chain security and open source software security. And the questions coming from the Congress people, not just what was prepared for them by their staffs, but the responses that they gave themselves to the questions, the banter back and forth, indicated they knew what they were talking about, that they had been either developers themselves, and I know that's in the history of some of the folks on that committee, or worked with technology organizations and genuinely wanted to figure out what's the right thing for American citizens, what's the right public policy, that sort of thing. And we're very clueful about threats that are out there, but also opportunities. They didn't have a dismissive attitude towards open source software that I think we're so used to. So part of it has been the long slog of the last 30 years of educating both Congress and people who are the long-term folks in government and policymakers about open source software and open technology. One of the, I think, best sources for this has been the Kennedy School at Harvard, where so many future policymakers, take courses. Now has a huge number of people teaching technology policy who are very wise to open technology culture and the like. And I decided to spend some time in DC, not because I wanted a career shift, but because I kind of wanted to do my part. And I think every technologist, everybody listening to this podcast has a duty. I almost said obligation, but I kind of feel that way, obligation, to find a way to participate and lend their expertise to the systems of government to help them make smarter decisions, help educate them about open software, open standards, open technology culture, the like. Whether you work for government or simply work for an organization that exists around government is kind of fine. Just don't do it to build a career. Do it to have an impact. And you'd be amazed how far you can go when you're worried more about the latter than the former. And I think as a result of many people doing that, especially from the Obama years forward, and planting seeds and helping rescue healthcare gov and other things like that, I think we're in a much better spot in the United States, and many other countries are following suit. The U.S. right now is clearly taking the lead on security and open source software, and other countries are watching what's going on there, in the EU and Japan and Singapore and the like. But I'm much more reassured about this than I've ever been, that they get it, and hopefully that getting it can also be connected to the resources to address the kinds of issues that we see out there.
Yeah. So I have to say, I agree, Brian. My day job is being the Standards and Policy Director for Europe for the Open Source Initiative. And we're just staffing up in that area because we're discovering that governments are taking open source so seriously that they're beginning to frame policy that both uses it and influences it. And as a consequence, that needs input, a voice that's coming from the every person developer rather than only from the big corporate lobbyists that the 501c6 trade associations represent. So I'm with you completely. I think that is beginning to happen. I see the divide as being in the US, the focus is very much on security and supply chain. In Europe, the focus is very much on privacy and on the control of technology. Do you think those two things can be reconciled, or do you think we're going to see a war, so to speak, between Europe and the US over open source and regulating it? I'm told that we have to have I'm told we have to have a quick answer, so that's probably a really bad question to ask you.
I don't see a dichotomy there, Simon. I don't see, corporations care about their privacy too, just as much as individuals do. Their own privacy, of course.
Yes.
And I think there's so many of the privacy technologies come from the bottoms up, but are seized and grabbed a hold of and taken further by companies. But this whole dichotomy between companies and developers, I don't see. Software developers and open source have been funded and resourced by companies, startups to large ones, since the earliest days. And I think we just need to do less of this kind of positioning of battle between the two than we tend to see some folks.
Yeah, no, I don't think I'm pointing at a dichotomy there. I think what I'm suggesting is that Europe is very much focused on the privacy of the individual, and that is being weaponized by the European corporations. Whereas in the US, it's very much about the security of the supply chain, and that's being weaponized by the US corporations. And I think both are going to result in attempts to regulate open source in one way or the other, or enact regulations that affect open source. And I think that's where there's going to be a conflict between the two sides.
Okay, well, maybe it's the optimist in me, but I don't see them as irreconcilable. I see them as additive. Yeah.
Doc, should we go that way?
And
you're muted, Doc.
I have to get off mute before I start talking, and then I don't. This is an old dog that, there it is. Anyway, so Brian, quickly, is there anything we haven't asked that you'd like to have touched on? If we can touch on it briefly.
No, the work we're doing at OpenSSF is work that we hope helps every open source project, that we hope addresses some of the long-term issues we've had in open source around sustainability, recognizes the role that open source now plays in critical infrastructure, and the need that society has for us to try to reduce the number of Log4Shells out there or make it easier to recover from when they happen. And that's really the message I'm on these days, and wanting to raise awareness around, and that we could use everybody's help. There's actually a really small core group of people making OpenSSF happen, and I think every open source project and every open source using organization has a role to play in this fight. So we'd love to see love to see folks help us with that fight.
That's great, and I hope people watching and listening will do that. Final pair of questions. What's your favorite text editor and scripting language?
I'm still an Emacs guy, although I obviously end up writing a lot of emails in Pine, so I have to count Pico, I guess, informally for that. Yes, I still use a text mode mail client for like my personal emails. Work mail is still Thunderbird, but I still love kind of text mode and terminal kinds of apps. I think there's a reductionism to it that is just lovely. What was the other question? Text scripting language, I guess. Oh, scripting language. It's kind of like it's hard to give up your first love or your first kind of thing that you really immersed in. And so if I had a gun pointed at my head and I had to write software, and frankly, none of you want to see the software that I would have to write these days, it would still be Perl. Yeah. Wow. That's a minority answer, although we do get more than a few of those. So, somebody wrote here, favorite code repo, favorite web server. We probably guessed the favorite web server. The favorite web server is easy. It's Nginx, of course. I can't use it though. I'm not Russian.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a little of the back channel on the
ew, Perl, yuck. Yeah, I know. Screen. Well.
So this has been great, Brian. It's been awesome having you on the show. You always manage to pack a lot into every answer, and I'm glad to have you on. We'll have to have you back soon to see how everything's going.
Thanks, Doc. It's really great to see you, and thank you, Simon, too.
So, Simon, a lot packed in there. I think Brian.
There was.
I was joking in the back channel that I don't think anybody's going to listen to Brian at 1.5 or even 1.4 because I think he talks faster than anybody we've had on the show, which is a good thing, actually.
Yeah, well, it's good to have it's good to have the show extended out to an hour and a half, and it's as always. I think Brian is as upbeat and thoughtful, and what is there to say on those issues? There's plenty of discussing that we can do around every one of the topics that we were discussing there.
Yeah, I love how much he works on making the world work, and I suppose every open source developer is doing that, but I think Brian is much more global than many others, and doing taking on the hard thing. Before that, it was with Hyperledger, which is really difficult. Not Hyperledger, but the general category with blockchain and all of that. Just to go to the crazy places and make the best of it. I really like what he's doing, and he's a hell of a disc jockey too, by the way.
Well, absolutely. One of the things that we did at the ApacheCon in Oakland was put on a rave disco in his honor at the ApacheCon there, and I don't think people realize the influence that the underground music scene has had on the world of open source through bringing Brian into developing software publicly in the way that he has. That's definitely worth covering at some point, I think.
That's an interesting thing. I wish I knew the music better. When we were at D-Webcamp, Brian was showing me his controls on the laptop and what he was doing and all the different, and lots of interesting things about the artists, and about which, of course, I know almost nothing. Probably nothing is it. Nothing will do. And I've probably already forgotten which Brian was showing me, but it was totally interesting while I was standing there watching him, play his mighty Wurlitzer. It's great stuff. So what have you got to, let's see, Life of Brian. Oh, that's an interesting. So yeah, we come up with names for the show. Life of Brian. Well, people might actually think it is Monty Python, though.
Well, and what with Brian always looking on the bright side of life.
Yeah. So okay, we can go over look at the bright side. That's an interesting thought. Well, this is great. So what do you want to plug there, or did I already ask you that?
Well, no, you haven't. The thing that I think a lot of listeners and viewers will be interested in is at OSI, one of our new directions has been to start a podcast on some big issues, and we have started a podcast about the licensing and ethics of artificial intelligence called Deep Dive. So if you go to deepdive.opensource.org, the podcast is there, completely unaffected by the identity of any sponsors. We've gone out and found the key individuals around the ethics, licensing, and direction of AI. And we've interviewed them, and then our next phase will be to hold some panels where we begin to work through the deep issues. And I think I would love to see the folks who follow FLOSS Weekly going along to deepdive.opensource.org and listening to the podcasts, and then maybe watching the panels when they come out, because I think they're going to be really good. They're going to be very much determining the future. That they're not committed to being upbeat and positive. We are willing to say that there are some difficult and bad things, but on the other hand, we are trying to be constructive and to drive the argument from the perspective of the individual rather than of the corporation that is trying to leverage AI.
Yeah. It might be the most important topic. I think I've just tried to list the most important topics. It's one of them. I think the mysteries of AI, I think we need human comprehension of whatever we're doing, whatever that is, and to not have it, or to have some other form of comprehension competing with ours or manipulating ours, is hugely, hugely interesting. So people should go there, check that one out. We haven't confirmed a guest for next week, so I'm not going to plug that. But I will plug the show. Please come back next week. In the meantime, I will be back in my office in Indiana, where I'll have the right microphone and the right everything else. The sun will not be moving across my face like it has here and the screen. Anyway, it's been great having Brian on the show. Thank you, Simon, and we'll see you next week.
Listeners of this program get an ad-free version if they're members of Club TWiT. $7 a month gives you ad-free versions of all of our shows, plus membership in the Club TWiT Discord, a great clubhouse for TWiT listeners. And finally, the TWiT Plus feed with shows like Stacy's Book Club, The Untitled Linux Show, The Giz Fizz, and more. Go to twit.tv/clubtwit. And thanks for your support.